You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on ShockwaveSkullSessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian.
Shockwave Skull Sessions. We've got returning guests, Bob Mayo and Horace Cordier. Am I saying that correct, Horace?
Cordier, doesn't matter.
Cordier, that's right. I remember we went through this last time. Bob and Horace, how you guys doing?
Good.
Great.
All right. Of course, we had this team on, that was about 4 or 5 episodes back, and we touched on some of the underground metal albums, or hard rock metal albums of the 70s, kind of bands that kind of got lost in the shuffle, so to speak. We went through 10, I believe, last time. I know we did a Golden Earring, Bang, the debut Trust, Blood Rock's debut, White Witch, Lucifer's Friend, Blue Cheer, their second album. Outside Inside, the debut Cactus, Night Sun, and Ursa Major. And if you guys want to check out that episode, that is, I don't know what number it is, but you could find it a few episodes back. So we're going to continue on because we were hoping to get 20 in, and we obviously were only able to get 10. So we got 10 more albums we're going to go through. Should I announce what albums we're going to talk about before we start, or should we keep it as a surprise as people go on?
Just announce them, I guess, as we go, so people don't know exactly what's coming up.
There you go. All right. So just to distinct the voices, that is Horace there. And Bob, why don't you introduce yourself so people could distinguish voices?
Okay, yeah, this is Bob Mayo. I was in a thrash band a long time ago called Wargasm. I was the bassist and the vocalist, and this is the sound of my voice.
All right. Of course, Wargasm, great band back from the 80s. And are you still, I know you're still performing, right? Or are you still doing stuff with the Wargasm guys, or just kind of doing your own thing?
I'm mostly recording just my own stuff right now and performing, but very rarely. Wargasm is pretty much done, but we are reissuing all the Wargasm albums little by little over the years. So there's still some activity there.
All right, very cool. We'll definitely check that out. So, all right, let's start off. One of the ones, I don't remember if this was from Bob or Horace, but one of the albums you brought up was a band I was pretty much unfamiliar with. I remember seeing the name and seeing them in used record stores. The band is called Hard Stuff, and the album is Bulletproof. Was this their debut record?
It was, yeah. They actually evolved from a band called Daemon, Daemon. And there's some names in here that you probably will remember as well. John Gustafson is the bass player vocalist in this 3-piece band. He was in Quatermass, the keyboard-dominated prog band.
Black Sheep of the Family, right?
Yeah,
Right.
They originated Black Sheep of the Family, which Rainbow covered on Richie's first Rainbow album.
Right.
Two guys from Atomic Rooster also in this band.
That's right.
John Ducan, or John Can, as he was represented on this record. And so it's a 3-piece. It rocks really hard. This record is one of my favorites in the pile that we're going to talk about today. It's really loose and live and spontaneous sounding. There's even some improvised jams on the record, instrumental jams that were given titles, just to add to that vibe, that loose kind of rehearsal space kind of vibe. But the songs really rock. They're a lot of fun. The second album, Bolex Dementia, should be on this list too, maybe another time, but that's a lot more prog. This one's really meat and potatoes, 3-piece, guitar, bass, drums, vocals. The songs are a lot of fun, and they're all 3 fantastic players. I really recommend this record. I'm not sure if this was my pick or if it was Horace, but I guarantee you that Horace is going to tell you that he loves this record too.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of this one. This was actually Bob's pick, and it's a great record. Hard Stuff are interesting because they also have a lot of Deep Purple connections, because they were one of the bands signed to Purple Record, and so I think, if I remember correctly, they actually had some interesting touring stuff related to either Deep Purple or offshoots of Deep Purple. There's sort of that weird group of bands that kind of circle Purple, like Nazareth were on their Come Taste the Band tour. But anyway, so Hard Stuff, and anyone interested in these records, by the way, there's a very nice anthology put out by, I think it's HNE, and Purple Records, and it's the Hard Stuff anthology, and it's essentially both of their full-length albums and any stray B-sides, all compiled on one 2 CD set. But back to this record, this is the more straightforward metal record. The second record it's funny that Mayo called it kind of proggy. I've considered it, it's proggy, but it also has a funky song called Roll a Rocket. It's kind of a little bit more diverse stylistically, whereas the first one, not Bullock's Dementia, the first one, Bulletproof, is really kind of what I would call classic proto-metal. So it's pretty heavy. Everybody's pretty much on point. There are a couple of jams, but it's pretty rough stuff. So, I mean, anybody that's into stuff like Dust and Bang and, the heavier end of the proto-metal spectrum would definitely dig this record. And also, all three guys are stellar musicians. It's one of those bands where all of the players are really good.
John Gustafson, too, the bass player and the vocalist, John Gustafson, not only did he come from Quartermass, but he also, after this, ended up in the Ian Gillan band.
That's right.
And after that, he was in Roxy Music. So, super versatile, great bass player. As a bass player myself, he's one of my favorite bass players.
He's a wonderful bass player, but very diverse. It's kind of like Carmen Appice playing on Rod Stewart records and in Cactus. So some of these guys get around. They can. It's a sign of a good musician if you can play multiple genres.
And when you say Ian Gillan band, that is not the band Gillan. That is Ian Gillan band.
No, it's the jazzy,
the Child in Time record. Was that their only record?
Put out 3 records and a live album, Live in Tokyo, double album, and then Scarabus with twin exhaust.
Clear Air Turbulence. Clear Air Turbulence.
Yeah, I was.
Child in Time, Clear Air Turbulence, Scarabus.
Okay, I just remember buying the Child in Time. I picked that up used, and I was really disappointed. And then when Gillan started,
it's the weakest of the Ian Gillan band albums.
Okay, I'll have to check that. And I do notice here that both Ian Gillan and Roger Glover co-wrote with Gustafson the song "Monster in Paradise." So again, strong Deep Purple connection.
Lots of Purple connections.
1972,
Gustafson has a song on the Butterfly Ball album, Roger Glover's Butterfly Ball, which is a big party, the Purple Family Tree party, and the song is called The Bat, and it's awesome.
It's great. Well, I love that. I love that whole Butterfly Ball album, but that's one of the absolute highlights of it.
That is a good album, definitely underrated. What happened to the guys in the band after... Atomic Rooster only lasted?
They're sadly all dead now. This is one of those Motorhead situations where all the members are now no longer with us.
Did they do anything after Hard Stuff? You mentioned that Ian Gillan Banning went on to Roxy Music. Gustafson, what about the other guys?
The drummer went back to Atomic Rooster reformed. There was the 1980s version of Atomic Rooster. Remember, Vincent Crane reformed Atomic Rooster, turned it into more of a kind of traditional metal act. And I think John McCoy was on bass, but I think the drummer returned, who's also on Hard Stuff. So past that, I think he died fairly young. So I don't know if he did much past the reformation of Atomic Rooster.
And that's another band that never really got their dues, at least here in America. I don't know how they were.
No, they never got their due. And Atomic Rooster were an absolutely amazing band. I mean, you want to talk about like dark, heavy, metal-y prog, they were absolutely great at it.
Right. I know we got them listed here as an honorable mention we could talk about a little bit later. But I used to read about them in Cream and Circus all the time, little blurbs about Atomic Rooster. They were one of those bands I had to backtrack on. Cool. Yeah. So anything else regarding Hard Proof, or should we move on? Hard stuff.
Just to quickly note that pick it up if you want to hear everything they did. Pick up the 2-CD thing that's called the Hard Stuff Anthology. And also be aware that Kissing Spell, the British label, put out the Hard Stuff album under its original title, where they were called Daemon, Daemon. And those are actually different mixes. So the Daemon Entrance to Hell album is basically the Hard Stuff it's kind of Bulletproof with different mixes, if anybody's really obsessive about this stuff.
So Damon put out a record, then Hard Stuff did the 2 records. Is that correct?
No. Many years after the release of the official Hard Stuff album, the Kissing Spell label in the UK, which specialized in unearthing old material, put out an album by a band called Damon, which is actually Hard Stuff. This came out in the 90s. But it's different mixes of the Hard Stuff tracks. So it's Hard Stuff under a different name.
Oh, is it?
It's a ripoff. I'm sure it wasn't even like a legal. Kissing Spell were a very interesting kind of strange label that kind of skirted around.
All right, well, let's go ahead and move on then. Why don't we get to a Granicus debut album, self-titled debut. You want to start that one off, Bob?
Sure. Granicus to me is kind of a cross between the twin guitar Aerosmith kind of sound and Led Zeppelin. They're a great signpost in the evolution of like U.S. metal, but they have a lot of Zeppelin in them. It's worth searching out for sure as a signifier of the time period. It's an excellent record. And you can really hear, again, I know we meandered down this path last time we talked, but the influence of bands like Sabbath and Purple and Zeppelin we're having on the next generation of bands, it's really apparent on this record. It's kind of like the Greta Van Fleet of their day back then. To be honest with you guys, the vocals are really high-pitched, and it's a love it or hate it kind of thing, and I kind of fall on the hate it. I'm not a fan of this record. As a listen, as a culturally, historically significant record, it's definitely worth searching out as an artifact of the time. It's not something I put on very often because this guy's vocals just it's like getting stabbed in the ear with a screwdriver to me. I'm not a fan.
What about you, Horace?
Has Mad Dog heard this record? Because I think this was one of the ones you weren't familiar with.
I wasn't familiar with, and this was one of the ones I did not get a chance to listen to. But I remember I believe on the last one, I did go through a lot of these bands, and I did recall this vocalist, and he was kind of an annoying vocalist.
By the way, this one was actually my pick.
Right,
the Granicus. So my thing with this is, unlike Bob, I'm actually a huge fan of this record. And these were one of the guys that I discovered fairly late in my trawling around for this. And it's funny because, yes, the singer is absolutely a love it or hate it proposition. There's a level of insanity that this guy's operating on, kind of like the White Witch guy, who also is a guy that either you love it or you hate it. And this guy, it sounds like somebody stuck an electric cattle prod up his ass and hit the switch. Right. Because this guy has the craziest. There's a falsetto on this that he hits. And the other thing with this record is it's a great example of an album that it's got a few good tracks, and then it has two tracks that are just like so far above that you never forget. And one of them is one of the great, there's a great Warren Zevon song where he's like dissing a city. I forget what it is, but this one's called Cleveland, Ohio. And it's basically one big fat middle finger to the city of Cleveland. The lyrics are hilarious. And it's just, the guy's singing about how much he hates Cleveland, how everybody's unhip and uncool, and he just wants to get the hell out of here and go to California because this whole place just sucks. And it's absolutely hilarious. And then the other one is this crazy, like, pro-American Indian thing that's all about, America and who stole this land.
You're in America.
And you're in America. And when there's a line where he says, who stole this land? We did. And he's so high up on the register when he says we did, it took me like 4 years to even figure out what the hell he was saying. I was like, and I'm like, what is that? And then
that's
finally,
a great song.
That's an amazing song. And the thing is, I thought he was saying wicked. Mm-hmm. He's saying we did. But he's totally off the charts. So he's like the King Diamond of proto-metal. You're going to love it, or you're going to be like, no. I mean, there's the guys like registers, like Robert Plant, if he was really out of control and had absolutely no breath control and whatever, but he can hit the notes. I mean, he can screech. So anyway, the only other thing I'd say about this particular record is I like the rhythm section a lot. It has a lot of shuffle. It has that kind of that John Bonham kind of drum thing, but like the guy is nimble. So it's like there's a good interplay with the rhythm section on this one. But yes, the vocals.
Yeah, musically, it's very solid musically. And if there was just some way to turn down the vocals just a tad, then maybe I'd enjoy it a little more. But musically, it's great. The songs are put together well, and they're played really well. But just the frosting on top of the cake.
You may not be a fan of super high-pitched, nuts caught in a trap vocals.
Yeah. When I heard Rush for the first time, I was kind of like, what is this? And then you kind of, you hear the music and the way everything's put together.
Rush is interesting. Rush is hugely polarizing. And what's fascinating is that I have always been the rarest of listeners. I like Rush. I don't love them. They're not one of my favorite bands. I certainly don't hate them. I don't have any problem with Geddy Lee's voice. But finding people that just like Rush and enjoy most of their albums, very hard.
It's a love-hate thing,
absolutely adore that band or hate them. Yeah,
very true. I'm looking at Granicus' discography, and this debut album came out in 1973. And then it says, did they reform, or is it later? It says there's an album called Thieves, Liars, and Traitors that came out in 2010.
The second album is outtakes, and I think maybe a little bit of re-recording, but it was discovered like 30 years later. And the information on it is a little sketchy. I think it was originally only sold on Bandcamp. You had a hard time finding the so I don't know. It could be one of those things where, a guy was in the band back in the 70s, dug up, some extra recordings from his basement and released them. There's some good stuff on that. It's kind of a mini LP. If I remember correctly, it's about 30 minutes long.
Yeah, it has 9 songs. So yeah. And then there's a third one.
Right. And also the Granicus has never had, maybe H&E or somebody should fix that, but it's never had a proper reissue. So the best CD you can get now is still a bootleg on, what's that label? Free Records, which is a German bootleg label. And that's the best version you can get. It's clearly ripped from vinyl and it sounds okay. It also has some extremely rough sounding bonus tracks, which are from a radio station broadcast, which is really interesting because it's like the band sitting and doing like a couple of interviews and they play like 3 songs live. And it's just the whole thing is super rough. But unfortunately, I can't recommend somebody an official release of this unless you get the vinyl, because it has not had a proper reissue, unfortunately.
Right. Well, it's interesting. Obviously, they're from Cleveland, Ohio, and there was a lot of bands from the Midwest coming out. I mean, you look at even the Detroit scene, which happened in the late 60s, which was like the huge scene, obviously with Iggy Pop and the Stooges and MC5 and Ted Nugent.
Also Dick Wagner.
Dick Wagner, the Frost, who we talked about, I believe, on the last one, and, Mitch
Ted
Ryder.
For a long time.
Ted. I mean, so many stuff. And then, of course, you had the whole Motown thing. And it was like a thriving thing in the Midwest, and Cleveland was definitely a thriving metal city. All the bands loved, and they had the best festivals. I mean, the Rushes, AC/DCs, all those bands were much bigger out there. And then you had, bands like The Gods. I remember a lot of these, Ohio-based bands. You would see those albums in the used record store.
Best golden earring cover ever.
Oh, really? Did they do a golden earring cover?
They do the most insane version of Candy's Going Bad. It's about 9 minutes long, and it has a huge drum solo in it, and it's not Radar Love. They do Candy's Going Bad. The Gods do it on their debut album, and it's absolutely monster cover version.
Wow. Well, that got me thinking when you mentioned about the singer writing about the song Cleveland, Ohio, and how it sucks and how he wants to go to. I could kind of see why, because it seems like a lot of these Cleveland or Midwest bands in general, they put out 1 or 2 records and that never really hit, and they kind of broke up. That seems to be the case with this band, too.
And also, remember, adversity creates great music. So if you're in a shitty town and you're not happy, you got a lot of anger, maybe you're going to make some good metal and hard rock.
Sure. But, most of those bands ended, like a band like Angel, they moved to L.A. A lot of these bands that weren't from L.A., they either moved to L.A. or New York. Let's move on to what we have third in our list. Interesting pick here. I don't remember if this was from Horace or Bob. The band Montrose. I was going to say, obviously, their debut.
This is Bob's baby.
This is Bob's baby. Okay, everyone talks about their debut being so groundbreaking, which it definitely is, I would agree with. But, Bob, you picked up Paper Money for this.
I did.
Yeah.
I did. I thought the criteria for our discussion was an underground classic. So
correct.
Everybody agrees that Montrose's first record is a stone cold classic, right? Everybody knows that. And it definitely deserves that handle. But nobody ever talks about Paper Money. And I think that's because it was considered such a letdown after the first one. So, I really want to explore this for a few minutes with you guys and beg you to reevaluate this record. And anybody who's listening to this podcast, reevaluate this record. Try, if you can, to put your opinions and your passion for that first record aside and evaluate this record all by itself. It's a fantastic album. I mean, I can't think of any downside to this record at all, other than it's not as hard and heavy as the first one. Okay, so, maybe that's true. That doesn't make this a bad record, and it doesn't make it a worthy record of metalheads' attention. I think it's really short-sighted, in a way, to just dismiss this because it's not all balls to the wall from the beginning to the end. It has its heavy moments, but I mean, dynamics. You can tell I'm a little bit passionate about this. The dynamics themselves have value, I think, in a record. Otherwise, you come off as a little bit one-dimensional. And this record actually makes the first one look a little bit one-dimensional. I'm not taking anything away from that first record because I know I'll never hear the end of that.
You're not on with Monty. We're not going to give you a hard time.
No, you make up some interesting points, though.
It's the first album is just untouchable. Let's just get that on the table. It's untouchable. But I really, really believe that the second record doesn't deserve the bad rap that it has. It's more dynamic. The material is more varied. Are those bad things? They're not bad things. These players, too, some of the best hard rock metal players there ever were, are on this record. So they elevate. Some of the lesser material is elevated just by their presence. There's kind of a ballady thing on it, but that's even interesting too because it's sung. The lead vocal is sung by Ronnie Montrose. When have you ever?
Now is that's not Space Age Sacrifice?
No,
it's We're Going Home.
Yeah.
We're Going Home, right? I didn't realize that was Ronnie singing. Wow, I've listened to that album so many times. I didn't even think it's like the fact that Ronnie was singing on that.
Yeah, so I mean, even as a curio, that's worthy of people's attention. I really think that this record has gotten a bad rap, and if it's evaluated on its own merits, it's fantastic. And I've Got the Fire on it, which is kind of
one of their best songs. Absolutely.
Got the Fire, which is like, interestingly, when Iron Maiden pick covers, they generally have very good taste in covers. That's the one they went for. They didn't go for something off the debut. They went for Got the Fire.
And it makes sense because it's the heaviest song on the record. There's also a guitar instrumental on it, and I mean, Ronnie Montrose is up there with the greats. So,
right,
I'm puzzled. I've always been puzzled since I've got this record back in high school. It's never referenced. You never read about it. Nobody ever name drops it. It's just kind of like it never happened, and I think that's a shame. I'm done.
Well, no, I'm actually going to defend the record as well. I think there's a couple of interesting things going on with this record. And actually, probably the guy who's spoken the most about this record is Sammy Hagar. Actually talked quite a bit about this record in his autobiography because it sort of coincided with, the end of his tenure in Montrose. And his sort of take was that Ronnie just couldn't kind of focus, and, they would have broke the bank by sticking with the formula on the first album, but Ronnie was sort of a restless creative type and wanted to, assume more control. He was having a battle of egos with Sammy. He wanted to kind of subdue him a bit, and he just decided he wanted to go in a little bit more, slightly more experimental direction. So Sammy isn't particularly complimentary about the record, but also I think part of that has to do with, and I say this as a guy who likes Sammy Hagar a lot as a human being, I don't think Sammy is the sharpest knife in the drawer in some ways. So I don't know if, maybe this kind of thing is, I don't know. But anyway, back to the record. I think the reason why it kind of got the negative flack that it did is that it was too far of a step. I think if this had been their third album or had been a little bit of a mix, more of a mix of records one and what it is, I sort of liken it a little bit to Deep Purple's Fireball, which is sort of the forgotten album in between In Rock and Machine Head. And it's the one that Ritchie Blackmore wasn't particularly happy with, but Ian Gillan loved. So it's a little bit more experimental. It's definitely mellower. There's I remember listening to it very carefully when I thought we were going to get to it on the last podcast. And I remember noticing, I think maybe Mayo can correct me, I think there's kind of really only 2 or 3 real rockers. And then there's the rest is either mellow or kind of almost proggy, very dreamy. I mean, to me, this is an album that would sound really great if you were an astronaut listening to it in outer space. There's sort of a liquid water type flow to parts of this record. It's kind of mesmerizing, which is interesting because that's the opposite of the first album, which is basically doing the same kind of thing the first Van Halen album did, which is kind of just blowing your head off. I like this record. I just think maybe if it had maybe 1 or 2 more super heavy songs on it, maybe it would have been better received. But
I will say this, that part of the eclecticism of this record, it includes a Rolling Stones cover.
Right.
So underground, Connection.
Yeah. It starts off with what sounds like an attempt at a single, which is Underground. And then it follows that up with the Stones cover. So right off the bat, you're 2 songs in, and you're like, this is not what I expected.
And Underground was a cover too, wasn't it? Underground, hold on. Yeah, Eileen Rappaport, whoever that might be. An American singer-songwriter, producer.
So clearly Ronnie was trying to expand the palette. That was a serious decision that he was making. Yeah.
Definitely.
But I think I bring that up. The reason I brought that up is because I think that a lot of people were 2 songs in and they gave up.
I agree. This album on its own is not a bad record. It doesn't deserve the flack that everyone gives it. But
no.
If you compare this to the debut record, and I thought the sequencing was horrible. Like I remember hearing all aside one for one, the opening track, Underground, not a powerful track at all. I mean, if they opened it up with "I Got the Fire," which was an absolutely killer track, which it opens side 2. And side 2, I love side 2. It's such an unbalanced album. Side 1, which should be the better side, has the weakest songs. I mean, Underground, I thought was, they're going a little experimental. Then they do a Stones cover. And then The Dreamer, I thought was a pretty good song. That was all right.
The Dreamer is good.
That's a good tune.
I would have buried the first track, and the second track should have been somewhere in the middle of the album.
Absolutely.
It should have opened with a rocker. It should have closed with something strong.
Well, this is a great call out because not a lot of people realize how important the sequencing of a record is.
Absolutely.
And it really can kill a record.
I think this had a lot to do with this because, you want the first song and the third song, usually when it comes to sequencing records, the first song and the third song to be the powerful songs.
Or you want to do the Black Sabbath Heaven and Hell thing where you open with the rocker and you close. You need to close side 1 or side 2. If that's what you've got, you close that with some kind of an epic. There are definitely ways. And of course, now with CDs and iPods and all that other stuff,
it doesn't matter.
You can just sequence it any way you want, but that was not the case back in the day.
Now, side 2, I absolutely love. I Got the Fire, one of the greatest American metal songs written. I think probably Montrose's strongest song, one of the greatest riffs. What an amazing riff. Space Age Sacrifice, love that song. What a great, really great, well-written song. Sammy Hagar sings his ass off. It's got that very tranquil kind of spacey kind of great chorus in it.
I would also make a point of, regardless of whatever his feelings on the record are, this has some of Sammy's best singing. He really performs very well on this album.
Yeah.
And he's required to do stuff on this that's a little bit more subtle than what he's sort of asked to do on the first album. And he does a really good job. He does a really good job on the mellow songs. I mean, he has a great voice.
Right.
But he does a very good job singing on this album, especially on some of the quieter material. And he sounds great. I mean, I've always liked Sammy's voice. But if you compare it to like his later singing during the Geffen years, I mean, he sounds fine, but it's not all that imaginative. This is some of his best stuff, I think.
Absolutely,
vocal wise.
And the closing track, which I thought was odd, they made it the closing track. The title track, Paper Money. That's a great tune too. I love the bass drum groove on that. What a killer bass drum groove.
There's some kind of funk in that one.
Yeah, it's funky, it's different. And I get what Montrose was going for. I think, with him, with a lot of bands, they think, okay, they put their debut record out, they were unhappy with its simplicity. They're like, I much more of a intricate guitar player. I could do much more than this debut record, which most of the fans just loved. And, Ronnie was a very experimental guy, which you obviously know in his records that follow on, of course, with the Gamma stuff. He was never really satisfied. And that was, I always thought was a problem with a lot of musicians.
He was a very restless guy.
Very much so, I've heard.
Yeah. And I mean, you look at the Gamma stuff, which is also amazing, but there's a lot more synthesizer on that. Yeah. He was
very experimental. But I agree with, I think Horace said if they were to do this on their third or fourth record, that would make a lot more sense. But to come out of the bat.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it was too sudden. Also, losing Sammy, I think, definitely hurt them. I do like the Bob's James records. I think there's some interesting.
There's some good stuff. Production-wise, it's not nearly as good as these first two. Obviously, Ted Templeman.
No, I mean, and that's the sad thing of Montrose is they had a career where they're the guys who really picked up the best of what they did just on a career level as opposed to musical level, even though they're seriously. If you look at what Van Halen did, where they were very clear about, okay, the second album isn't as good as the first album, but it's very much in the same ballpark. They stuck to the same kind of plan. And by the time they got to Women and Children First, they were maintaining a level of strength, whereas Ronnie was just kind of, because I really do think that first Montrose album is very similar to me in impact to the first Van Halen.
Oh, absolutely. That was the blueprint for Van Halen. Absolutely. I mean, of course, Van Halen used to cover Montrose songs, and, with Ted Templeman
Van Halen
there.
Covered everybody. But they covered a lot of Montrose.
But I think somebody at the label, at Warner Brothers, and this is a mistake, again, with the label and what you say is so important about sequencing, Bob. All they had to do was flip-flop. If the A&R guy or someone at the label just said, simple, let's put side 2 as side 1, side 1 as side 2, I think the record would have had a whole different perspective just with that little change. Anyway.
One final shout out on this record is anybody picking it up, interested in it, by all means, pick up they're from a couple of years ago. Both of the first two Montrose albums got beautiful 2 CD versions that have amazing radio station live concerts as bonus discs.
Oh, wow.
And those are absolutely worth picking up. The remastering is not brick-walled. It's really nice. And actually, the live album from the Paper Money tour is fantastic. So anybody that wants to hear this band on, tours for both of these albums, the first one for the debut, second one for Paper Money, definitely pick those up. And they even have like a cool San Francisco DJ who has one of the most amazing voices I've ever heard. And he like introduces the band and whatever. So those are definitely worth picking up. If anybody's interested in Montrose, pick up the first 2 albums on the 2 CD versions that were put out by Warner Brothers or whoever. It was a couple of years ago. I think Bob has these. Mayo has these. I have these. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move on to, speaking of underground classics, Angel, hell of a band. You want to start that out, Horace?
Sure. Okay, so the thing with Angel is when I first started discovering this earlier stuff, there's a few other genres of music that I like. I happen to like a fair amount of prog rock, and one of the bands I've always loved is Yes. And it's not an accurate assessment, but when I was younger and not as sophisticated, I called these guys the heavy metal Yes. So they had this kind of thing with a lot of keyboard, just some interesting Deep Purple connections. I think Derek Lawrence. Did Derek Lawrence produce this one, or did he only produce the first one? I think he produced the first 2.
Derek Lawrence, he did produce this one, correct. Eddie Kramer did one of them.
Eddie Kramer did On Earth As It Is in Heaven,
yeah.
Which is the third album.
Right.
So the first 2 albums were produced by Derek Lawrence. Derek Lawrence wasn't the world's greatest producer because the Deep Purple stuff that he worked on was actually the early Deep Purple, the Nick Simper, Rod Evans Deep Purple. So I think he's the producer of Book of Taliesin or something. But he did understand something about keyboards. And the thing with the thing with Angel is the real 2 real stars of the show in Angel. They have a very good drummer, but I wouldn't necessarily call him the star of the show. The star of the show is the keyboard player, Greg Giuffria, who went on to form Giuffria, and Frank Dimino. I never could get his name quite right. But Frank, the singer, is amazing. He's got this natural, beautiful voice, high pitch, kind of like maybe a little bit like Steve Perry. I don't know. But good range, great voice. The keyboards are great. And it's all kind of, when they get to Hell of a Band, the first album is great. But when they get to Hell of a Band, they're kind of like the hard rock Star Wars band. I mean, there's moments where just like weird batteries of keyboards just are going like, bing, 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 it's like laser bombs going on in the middle of the album. And, also they had this incredible look, which was, they were the angelic version of Kiss. It's simultaneously awesome and patently ridiculous. You see them in long flowing robes. They had one of the craziest stage shows of the year. They were backed by Casablanca.
Sure.
They had tons of money at their disposal. They were coming out of cubes.
Sid and Marty Krofft actually designed their stage show, believe it or not.
Absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, to the point where if somebody said, we used to have these discussions and we'd say, if you get a time machine and see certain bands on tour, certain shows. I would love to see an Angel show at the height of their like magic act, because I have a feeling it was probably fairly unforgettable, and unfortunately, we don't really have any good film of it. But back to the music, it's inventive, it's epic, it has really good singing, and it has slightly not all that impressive guitar playing. But
I agree.
He's okay.
Punky,
he's up to the task. But this is the Greg Giuffria, Frank Domino show, and the drummer. I do like the drummer. So, but Punky he's okay.
I think that kind of hurt the band too. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was one of the strikes against them, that Punky was just kind of there, and they gave him plenty of spotlight time, but he just couldn't maximize on it. He couldn't capitalize on it. He's a okay guitar player. You know, Ace really, let's be frank, okay guitar player, but he was a genius at fitting what he could do into that context.
Yeah,
absolute genius.
Absolutely.
But Punky was kind of a one-trick pony, and he kind of, all of his solos are very samey and very simple. And when you're standing next to Greg Giuffria, and this guy's just a complete whiz on 18 different kinds of keyboards, it just makes you look even weaker than you already are. I'm not here to beat up on Punky, but he was the weak link.
Greg Giuffria's operating on he's sort of like doing it's like the John Lord of Angel, like the consummate muso that like has the ability to do a lot of different things. But in fairness to Punky, his guitar fits fine in the mix, but this isn't really a guitar-driven band. I mean, in some ways, I think they're actually driven more by the keyboards and the drums and the vocals than they are the guitar playing.
True. Yeah. And I think as far as their catalog goes, you know, they were on Casablanca and they kind of got sucked into that hype machine, that image machine. And this Hell of a Band is the first record where they actually debut that image. The first record shows them all in jeans and T-shirts on the inner sleeve. But this album is, in my mind, this is kind of their stained class, meaning it's the last honest record before they start to take steps towards commerciality on Earth as it is in heaven. And because it's that last honest record, I think it's the best showcase for what they were really capable of as a band without commercial concessions. All the songs are great. Every single song, one after the other, is very strong. The performances are all really strong. It's the example of what the band was capable of if they weren't chewed up and spit out by that hype machine at Casablanca.
Yeah. Some people swear by the third one, On Earth as in Heaven, but I think a lot of it has to do with people just sort of fanboying over Eddie Kramer. And I think it's a good record. It's a very good record, but it's also kind of schizophrenic. So it's where they become like they're half the Angel of the first two albums and they're half trying to be something commercial. Then when you get to White Hot, they're getting much more commercial.
Yeah.
And by the time you get to the one that was originally Bad Publicity, Sinful.
Yeah.
Which is a very deceptive album because if you look at the cover, you're expecting, featherweight, proto hair metal.
Right.
And it's a little heavier than that, but it's still nowhere near, it's not the heavy metal Yes anymore. That's over. That's the first two albums.
Yeah. I thought the early Angel was the best, the first three albums. And the second record, I think you're right, it does get a bit of a flack, but Angel was one of those bands that I think they just never really could decide what kind of a band they wanted to be. I mean, they started out, the first album kind of had a lot of that Rainbow kind of qualities, the song Tower. What a great anthem
Tower's
song.
amazing.
Well, fantastic. And it's funny, what you said, I think it was Horace that mentioned about the Star Warsy kind of keyboard stuff, and I was just thinking
that whole battery of like lasers.
Exactly, and I'm thinking at the time, the debut came out in 75, so this is probably before Asteroids and all that stuff came out, and it was probably groundbreaking for Greg Giuffria. You listen to it now, and it sounds silly. Back then, he's probably, this is groundbreaking.
Heard something like that on Battlestar Galactica or something, the old TV show.
Exactly. So I find that kind of funny, but I think Angel, kind of like Ronnie Montrose, he mean, Angel was one of those bands, they were based on image, as you said. A great live band. Unfortunately, I never saw them live, but you could catch a little bit from that movie Foxes, if you remember.
Yeah,
with
no,
Jodie
that was
Foster.
actually the first time I saw Angel was when I was a teenager, and I went to see Foxes in the theater, and I was like, what the hell is this?
Yeah, we tried when we did the Inside Metal series. We had Frank Domino, a great guy. He was featured, and we had...
I love Frank. He's a phenomenal singer. Great.
Yeah, we were looking to get some old footage, but it was very, very hard to get old footage. They weren't on Kirshner's or Midnight Special or any of those, or very rarely. No. And they are a band that never had a radio single. I think they tried later on, as you say, with Ain't Gonna Eat Out My Heart Anymore.
The closest they came was they had a mild hit with the soundtrack song to 20th Century Foxes, which is basically their disco song.
Right.
And it's half Giorgio Moroder.
Up in these parts in the Boston area, that song on White Hot, it was originally called Winter Song, and it was released as a single called Christmas Song to radio.
Oh yes, that was a hit. You're right.
Okay.
I'm not sure I'd call it a hit, but it used to get radio play seasonal up here in the Boston area.
I think the Rascals song they did, Ain't Gonna Eat Out My Heart Anymore, was probably the closest on the West Coast that I could recall.
Yeah, they had a couple of near misses. They were also a victim of a very inept record company that was kind of, Casablanca were really only interested in Kiss at that point.
Yeah, well, they were basically riding on the coattails of Kiss.
Cousins in White.
Exactly. Frank is a great singer. I could see at times a lot of people kind of like, Geddy Lee. A lot of people were annoyed by his voice when he would hit those highs. He could have a register that could be, a bit annoying to a lot of the casual listeners. So I could see how that might have turned some people off. But again, I think they were just an unbalanced band. They have some really heavy songs on this record.
It definitely went poppier.
Armageddon, one of my favorite prog metal records.
Lead on this one.
Let's do it, Mayo. Armageddon debut self-titled record, Armageddon.
Yeah, I'll give you a quick take on it. I'm not super familiar with this record other than owning it for maybe the last 6 or 8 years. I wasn't one of those people who had it back in 1975. But it's a great record. It actually, this one sounds like a second or third record to me. It's very advanced for a debut. The music on it is very advanced. The first song is in 5/4 time. I mean, for you non-musicians out there, take my word for it, that's extremely complex. And to open a record in 5/4 time, again with the sequencing idea in mind, that is a statement. We are here to play, and we are consummate musicians. And that theory is carried forward through the record. The playing and the writing is fantastic on this record. It does not sound like a debut. And also there's an 11-minute plus tune on here, too. So these guys were about the music as opposed to, where Angel lost their way with the image and stuff. These guys, obviously, from this record, were just here to play. It's a shame that they only did this one.
Well, Keith Ralph died very soon after, right?
Yeah, this is Keith Ralph's. I think this is his final project. I think maybe he did one solo single. He also was in ill health. He had breathing issues and I think he actually had COPD or something. I often said it would have been nice if he'd had sort of a more hard rock career to end things, but somebody explained to me that he really was not in very good physical health. This band never toured, and I think he died within a year or two.
He got electrocuted at a rehearsal or something.
I think Keith Ralph was actually practicing in his basement and had an ungrounded wire. Story for years that he died in his bathtub playing electric guitar in the bathtub. That's the fake story.
Right.
Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I mean, it's a sad way for anybody to go. But the thing with this band musically was they really didn't have any interest in image. This was a band full of seasoned British professionals. Martin Pugh from Steamhammer, Keith Ralph from the Yardbirds, and all the other stuff that he did. These were old vets, and they actually were playing heavier music than a lot of what they'd done before. I mean, if you've heard Steamhammer is it's like a Savoy Brown kind of thing,
right?
Sort of like a heavy blues thing. It's not proto-metal. And this thing is like progressive, but kind of also proto-metal. It has a huge opening track with the buzzing guitars, and it's pretty aggressive. And also Keith Ralph probably sings more aggressively on this than anything else that he did before. It's a long way removed from the Yardbirds, but it is very much one of those sad one and done. They did this, and then, fell apart. Ralph wasn't well, and they never toured it. But I've actually been listening to it for many years. It was one of the first proto-metal albums I picked up during that era when Repertoire were sort of digging up stuff left, right, and center back in the late 80s, early 90s. And they were one of the first guys to put this on CD, and I remember picking it up, and I've been in love with it ever since. And
I got it on Pony Canyon.
Welch liner notes.
Right. As I say, I picked it up. I was looking forever on CD and finally found it on Pony Canyon. I had to pay a little extra for a Japanese import, but
there was also a Japanese. There was also a weird period where Japanese labels would put out some of this rare stuff before anybody else in the UK, which is pretty funny if you think about it.
All right.
Bob was a drummer as well.
Oh, amazing drummer. I mean, the band were absolutely fantastic musicians.
Right, Bobby Caldwell from another one we're going to get to in a minute, the Captain Beyond drummers.
Right. A lot of similarity between the two. Yeah, see, to me, this is one of my favorite. I think this was the definitive prog metal record. A lot of people say, Rush and this and that, but this came out, in 75?
75.
This was considered like one of the first supergroups kind of thing for, Keith Relf from the Yardbirds, of course, Bobby Caldwell from Captain Beyond, Martin from Renaissance and Steamhammer. Yeah. So, and I just thought this was the ultimate prog, definitely proto-metal. This is a definitive prog metal record. It really has the best of both worlds. Incredible musicianship, great songwriting, and like you said, the 11-minute song, Basking in the Light of the Midnight Sun, there's like 4 different subtitles of that song, which just takes you to another era. I love it. Brother Ego, and then Basking in the Light of the Midnight Sun, then that riff comes back. What a fucking great riff. And it's a lot of bands used to do that. Yes, and all these bands, they would have a title with all these subtitles. Kansas did that as well. And it's a very proggy thing to do. Last Stand Before, what a killer groove in that song. Paths and Planes and Future Gains, tremendous metal song. And as you mentioned, the opener, Buzzard, with its off-time beat and just a killer opening riff.
Yeah, it's off-time, and it has that killer riff.
Oh, what a great riff. And, Silver Tightrope for a ballad, it's just a very tranquil ballad. I mean, all in all, great album. One of my all-time favorites. A lot of people argue about, the debut Captain Beyond, which we're going to get to next, too, which is obviously a great album. But to me, still, this debut Armageddon, this is the definitive prog metal record.
And I'll lead off on Captain Beyond. So the Captain Beyond album is canon proto-metal as far as I'm concerned. It's one of probably like the 10 or 20 albums. If I had to give somebody a primer on this stuff, it's right up there with the Lucifer's Friend and a few other things. Now, the interesting thing about the Captain Beyond is kind of like Keith Relf reinventing himself as a bit of a more heavy rock singer in the twilight of his career. This is where Rod Evans actually found a vehicle where he could be more effective as a heavy rock singer. Rod Evans, of course, being the first Deep Purple vocalist from, the Hush guy, from Book of Townsend, self-titled and whatever. And one of the early criticisms of the early Deep Purple, and I think one of the reasons why they got rid of him, is they felt that Rod Evans was a crooner, and he didn't really have enough balls in the voice. They needed somebody more powerful, more hard rock. Enter Ian Gillan. Now, if you listen to this album, the Captain Beyond album, Rod Evans is very convincing, singing some fairly heavy material. So that's part of what makes this album work. The other thing that makes this album work is you've got Bobby Caldwell on drums. And Bobby Caldwell is one of the great unheralded drummers. He's on the Carmen Appice level. He played with the Allman Brothers. He's played with Johnny Winter for years. I mean, the guy's amazing. And this album opens with one of the great drum grooves, which is, Dancing Madly Backwards on a Sea of Air, which I think nobody will ever forget that drum pattern.
That's a great record. So more about the pedigree of the band, too. Don't forget that Larry Reinhardt and Lee Dorman from Iron Butterfly are in the band, too.
Iron Butterfly. Mayo, you're breaking up a little bit. Are you away from the phone, or?
No, I'm right next to it.
Okay.
Is it better?
It's okay. I can hear you. Yeah, that's right. The Iron Butterfly guys. So this is another sort of quasi super group, kind of like Armageddon.
Right.
I was really surprised when I first found this record because I was never a Rod Evans fan. I found him kind of dull. But again, as Horace said, I totally agree. He really impresses on this record. He sounds really strong and really completely committed here. He's transformed. If he only sounded like this in Deep Purple, he might have not have gotten kicked out.
Right. I think that too.
Thank God he did. But
no, I think we're all happy to have. I think we're all happy to have you. I will say something very quickly funny about the Mark I Deep Purple. Nick Simper, the original Deep Purple bassist, was actually an amazing bassist. He was actually a phenomenal bass player. Probably a better bass player than Roger Glover. So maybe in an alternate universe they would have kept Nick Simper and gotten rid of Rod Evans. But Rod Evans was at his best in Captain Beyond.
Raging River of Fear is my favorite song on this record.
Probably my favorite. The other thing is this is the album where it's really half of it is one long suite. I mean, it's really one long song in multiple parts. It's a 3-minute song. It's an epic.
It is,
which is very proggy, and all of the songs flow into each other. You can't really separate them. You really need to listen to this album from beginning to end.
But I agree with you 100%. I was never a big Rod Evans fan in Deep Purple. I always thought he kind of had that Tom Jones-ish kind of, he's
a crooner.
Yeah, totally. But this album, it's amazing how, and it's surprising how it never I don't know how it was in England or the rest of Europe, but here in the States, I mean, I remember buying one of their latter albums used years ago, and I wasn't that into it. As a kid. And then actually our good friend David Teds turned me on. He goes, dude, you got to check out their debut record. And he got me a copy of that.
Debut,
and it was like,
wow. The thing with Captain Beyond is it's like the sort of like the Montreux syndrome, but even more extreme. The first album is an absolute stone cold classic. The second album is like a Santana jazz hard rock album, something called Sufficiently Breathless. Which is like half of it is like jazz rock. Now I happen to really like that. It's spacey, it's jazzy. It's nothing like the debut. And then that was it. They basically disappeared for a while, and then they came back with a guy named Willie DeFern on a third album. I forget what it's called. It's the guy hanging out in space. It's like 10 years later, like 76 or something. Okay. I can't remember the title of the record, which is embarrassing. But anyway. And then that's it. And of course, we do not have time to get into all of this, but there is also the saga of, the ill-fated fake Deep Purple and the shame of Rod Evans. And no one knows where Rod Evans is to this day. He's gone underground, never to be found again.
Wow.
But I did see Captain Beyond on tour. I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago. Bobby Caldwell got some musicians together, and it was actually an amazing show. He basically did this entire debut album and about half of Sufficiently Breathless and a couple other things. And it was at St. Vitus. And I remember that show being a lot of fun.
Wow. Well, again, a great underground metal classic. For prog metal fans, it's a must. Absolutely, this debut record.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's move on to Bow Wow, one of my favorite bands from Japan. Incredibly underrated band. This album, Signal Fire, I believe, came out, 74? Let me look it up here.
76.
Oh, 76. Okay, that's right. Why don't you go ahead and start off? I believe this was your pick, right, Horace?
Yeah, I'm eventually, hopefully we'll do that Japanese metal podcast.
Yeah, we're waiting for Marty Friedman. Marty, come on,
for
dude.
Marty. And my oldest childhood friend's son, who is, I think he's 11 now, or he's 12 now, and he's just got accepted to music school. He's such an amazing guitarist, this kid, and he absolutely worships Marty. So I have to make sure Marty says hello to him. I mean, he's a huge Marty Friedman fan. Anyway, but back to Bow Wow. This is the first, bar none, serious Japanese metal band, as opposed to, there's a lot of really interesting, fascinating kind of Japanese hard rock, stuff like Flower Traveling Band. Love all that stuff. But this is where the metal begins. And they had about a 5-year or at least a 3-year jump on Loudness, who are pretty much what everybody thinks of when they think of Japanese metal. So when you're dealing with Bow Wow, the main thing you're dealing with this band is you've got Kyoji Yamamoto on guitar, who is one of the greatest guitarists out there.
Absolutely.
He is right up there with Eddie Van Halen and Ronnie Montrose and all those guys. He's an incredibly skilled guitarist. He's the guy. And basically, the early Bow Wow stuff is an interesting mix of kind of lightning fast leads and a lot of really great lead guitar playing. And there's definitely like a little turbocharged boogie in there. It's sort of like they have a couple of like sort of rip-roaring numbers that, you know, are almost like Kiss party rockers.
Yeah.
But it has this really amazing guitar playing. And the rest of the guys in the band are very good. But for me, this is the Kyoji show. I mean, the guy to me is like he's just such a phenomenal guitarist. And Signal Fire has that really ripping track. What is it?
White
Get
Lightning.
On Your Train.
Oh yeah, White Lightning too. What a riff!
Yeah, great intro. Great intro.
Yeah.
Prelude and Get on Our Train. Right. So right away, right out of the gate. And I'm sorry, it's 1977. It's early in the game believe it or not, this is their third record. Their second album was something called Charge.
Oh, really? Okay.
So they had a debut that was called Bow Wow, and then they had an album called Charge, and then Signal Fire, and all of that leads into their first live album, which was called Super Live. But this, I think Mayo has actually, I love the entire Bow Wow catalog, but I think Mayo once told me that with your thing with Bow Wow is kind of up until the first live album, then you think they kind of lost the plot a bit.
Well, when they changed to Bow Wow, that's really where I lost track. But sticking with Signal Fire, the fascinating thing for me with this record is how you can hear, you know, like a lot of Japanese pop culture in the 70s, movies, TV. A lot of it was borrowed from U.S. pop culture at that time.
Right.
And you can hear that in this record. You can hear them kind of soaking up the influences and spitting them out with their own take.
Right.
An excellent example of this is the song titles. And one of the song titles is Rainbow of Sabbath.
That's right. That's on the debut.
I remember that, yeah.
Rainbow of Sabbath, right.
It's pretty clear where they're at with a title like that. But this is a rock solid record. They're not only are they kind of aping what else is out there, you know, in other countries happening with metal, but they're doing a really, really good job of it too, on its own merits. It's a very, very strong metal record. This record is an excellent statement of identity for this band. They really found themselves on this record, and they deserve to be mentioned with Rainbow and Sabbath. I mean, they deserve to be mentioned in any conversation, not just about Japanese metal, but this record should be mentioned.
And they were they're absolute contemporaries of, you know, this is 1977. So we're talking, this is right in the golden age of, you know, well, actually Sabbath were actually not doing all that great at this point, but this is the golden age for, you know, a lot of other bands. So they absolutely belong in that pantheon. I think the only thing that held them back is that very few people knew about them, though oddly they wound up becoming fairly well known in the UK of all places.
That's true. That's where I first heard about them in the first issue of Kerrang! Magazine on the Armed and Ready section. Yeah. You know, interesting career because they've, they were one of those bands, and I found out this later. A lot of 70s bands would put out 2 albums a year, but they said in Japan it was very normal for bands to put out at least 2 records, sometimes 3 records a year.
No, they had an insane catalog. They had an insane work ethic.
Yeah. As I say, I think because of that, some of their albums, again, kind of, you know, we go through the Montrose and all these other records, they're unbalanced. But Signal Fire, absolutely Signal Fire, and the record Warning from Stardust that came out in 82.
That's
supreme.
That's at the height of their UK fame. Those records actually got releases on Heavy Metal Records in the UK.
That's true.
And they played UK metal festivals. I mean, you could see Bow Wow at, like, you know, Earthshaker Festival somewhere in England. They probably played with Motorhead at some point.
I believe they toured with Kiss. I remember hearing they toured with Kiss somewhere. And they also played the Whiskey early on, the Whiskey A Go-Go that came out. But unfortunately, you know, Loudness, you know, when Loudness came out in 81 or whatever, you know, the first couple albums were on Japanese import, but that kind of built a buzz out here, and they came out here, and everyone...
Loudness very quickly assumed the pole position in Japanese metal, and at one point were as much the standard bearer for Japanese metal as, like, Crocus were for Swiss metal. They were just the one name. You know? Like, Japanese metal, Loudness.
And Akira, unbelievable guitar player, one of the greatest. But everyone overlooks, like you say, Kyoji Yamamoto.
Kyoji and
equally
Akira,
as good. Equally as good.
They're in the same
Absolutely.
When Kiss first went to Japan, it was that big deal. I mean, I remember Cream Magazine was all over when Kiss first went to Japan. That tour they did in Japan, Bow Wow was the opening band.
Okay,
that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, great band. Silver Lightning, that riff, and the production on those records, especially Warning from Stardust. I think one of the best produced albums. Your face,
they generally had
killer
very well
production.
produced albums. It's not a shoddy sounding catalog. No, it sounds good.
All right. And I actually did like the Bow Wow stuff, incidentally. A lot. Shockwaves and a couple of the other albums when Neil Murray joined. I thought some of the songs were
Neil Murray
good.
was on. I have a DVD or maybe even a Blu-ray that I got about a year ago from one of their big London shows in 1990.
Right.
Put the whole thing on film.
We got two more to go. We got Riot Narita, which I could spend an hour talking on, but I'm going to let you guys do it.
I'm an all-around Riot fan, but Mayo is a Guy Speranza early, the first Riot lineup guy. So he should lead on Narita.
All right.
Okay, and I'll be concise if I can. This record is proof that whatever was happening over in Britain with the new wave of British heavy metal, the same stuff was happening over here too. The media is just a lot different over here than it was and still is over in the UK. In terms of igniting trends. Riot exists as an example that same spirit, that same hard rock explosive sound was happening over here. It just wasn't getting any media attention or any record company attention either because of punk rock just kind of came and wrecked everything for everybody. This is an excellent example of what was happening here in the U.S. in the underground. They kind of accept it as an honorary new wave of British heavy metal band.
Right.
If I was going to pick any one of their records as their best, I would say it's Fire Down Under. But in terms of the underground classic waiting to be rediscovered, it's definitely Narita. Yeah. No question.
Yeah, this is the album where they really. I love the debut. There's a couple of really amazing songs on it. There's a thing called Overdrive. There's the song Warrior. They're fantastic. A couple of throwaways. This is the one where they really kind of got it together. It's great all the way through. It's their first great album. It's also the first where the sadly departed, who recently died, the guitarist on the first album, L.A. Kuvaris, who we lost to COVID not that long ago.
Oh, wow.
Yes. No, L.A. Yeah, he didn't make it through this pandemic.
Oh, wow.
It's very sad. Yeah, no, Monty told me that. But this is the album where they brought in, who's the second guitarist, Mayo?
Rick Ventura?
Rick Ventura, who's a very good player. But this is the album where they really got it together musically. Everything on it is great. It's also where their image cemented itself, for better or worse. We've got the rampaging lemming thing, getting firebombed on like a Tokyo runway. The whole thing is completely hilarious. And people either think it's ridiculous or terrible. But musically, yes. It's the American version of the new wave of British heavy metal. There's just something really honest and raw about this record. This is, guys from the hood. I mean, they're from our part of the neck of the woods out here. This is, a New York band. So
there's a lot of youthful exuberance you can hear on this record.
Youthful exuberance and a very interesting, very underrated singer. Guy Speranza was not your typical cock rock strutting. He was an interesting guy, apparently a lovely guy in real life, very shy, kind of like quiet. But he had a great voice, fit right in with the band. And you've got Mark Reel, who was one of the great underrated guitarists. And he's a wonderful guitarist. And he's just ripping on this thing. And this record has one of my favorite metal instrumentals, which is the song Narita.
Yeah.
Which is just a great pile driving. It's the kind of thing you want to go to war to. I mean, if you were a fighter pilot, you want to be playing this. So the whole thing is great. And it's got like a lot of thump, a lot of kick. And it's also the perfect stepping stone to, their masterpiece, which is the one they did after this, which is Fire Down Under. But everybody knows Fire Down Under.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say about this one that makes it a little superior in one respect to Fire Down Under is you don't have the weird ending with, the flashbacks audio track, which feels like it cuts 3 minutes out of an otherwise perfect album. This is an album where it's all songs. There's no gimmick at the end. That's pretty much it for me and Narita. I think if you're talking about U.S. Steel, like we used to say, this is like one of the prime examples of early American hard rock that's turning into metal.
100%. And as you say, so many people talk about Fire Down Under, which in my opinion is one of the greatest American heavy metal albums. And we talked about the first Montrose. We talk about the first Van Halen. Fire Down Under, I personally think surpasses them both as far as a true American metal record. And it's funny you mentioned Horace about, how they kind of tie in with the new wave of British heavy metal. First time, I remember reading little blips and blurbs about Riot in, Cream and Circus. And this was prior to Kerrang! Magazine coming out, who obviously idolized them. But prior to that, the Castle Donington compilation record, which came out in 1980, I remember buying that album. That was the first time I heard Riot, Road Racing. I was like, holy shit.
Yeah, and Riot's first live album is recorded at Donington and in England. They were huge in England, and they played on English festivals with new wave of British heavy metal bands. They were staple, and there were a lot of American bands like that. Another band like that was the Rods, who played in the UK for like 3 years straight on some of the biggest festivals going out there. So Riot were hugely popular in the UK. Matter of fact, I would say Riot were probably more popular in the UK than they were in the USA, except for Texas, where they were huge.
That is true, because that radio station,
which is a fascinating
San Antonio,
Texas has a taste for metal. Texas,
so the new wave of British heavy metal was not all British. If you really think about it, we had Riot, we had Crocus, we had Trust, we had Accept, It was really an international thing. It was just super.
Yeah, we had the EF band from Sweden.
Right.
There were everybody was falling into this thing. So,
but just to close this off, every song, start to finish, I would say 49er, one of my favorite songs. Just right at the beginning, Kick Down the Wall, as you say, Narita. What a great instrumental. Reminds me, it's kind of got that riff to a Light in the Black, Richie Blackmore. You could totally hear Mark Reale's Blackmore influence.
And that's Mark Reale's musical soulmates. He's a guy from that school. This is a guy from the Richie Blackmore, the serious guitar player, not fucking around,
underrated,
know your instrument school of guitar playing.
Yeah, start to finish, it's one of those albums. Just every song just kicks you in the head. Kick-ass album. Highly recommended. Absolutely one of the great American underground classics. Let's get to our final one. Speaking of underground classics, the debut Budgie record. Talk about new wave of British heavy metal. A lot of people always lump Budgie into the new wave of British heavy metal. I don't know if it's because Metallica had covered them with these other new wave of British heavy metal.
They're way too early. Budgie's way too early.
No, I agree with you. I'm just saying a lot of people consider them.
Because what happened with Budgie was they had a second act, the second part of their career, which was heavily subsidized by the new wave of British heavy metal, and that's the John Thomas era, where they got a different guitarist, and they did do all the same festivals as like a lot of the new wave of British heavy metal bands. But the Budgie that we're discussing, which is the debut, I guess I'll just start it off. So the first Budgie album it's totally proto-metal because we're talking
1971, I think, right?
No, it's 1970, I think.
Oh, wait, I'm looking at 71. Yeah, 71.
71. Okay. They are absolutely the contemporaries of Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. And the first Budgie album is produced by Roger Bain, the same guy who gave us the first Black Sabbath album, Paranoid and Master of Reality. So
I would say it's underproduced by Roger Bain.
I don't think Roger Bain. I love Roger Bain, but he's never going to be in the pantheon. He's kind of Vic Mail. Is anybody ever going to be like, oh my God, the productions on these records are amazing?
Well, so let me just interject for 1 second. If the songs are so strong on their debut, that I think the lack of production, I think, really doesn't do them justice, and I defer to you.
Okay, I will say that this album is a little. The production is weak, and not in a good way. Like, I actually maintain, I love the production on the first Black Sabbath album. It works perfectly for that album.
Agreed.
It doesn't quite work as well here, and I think something of that has to do with the fact that there is a lot of bottom end on this record, and cheap production doesn't do well when you need like something a little beefier on the bottom end. So maybe that's part of it. But the record itself, it's very heavy. And you've got Burke Shelley, who has one of those interesting, I guess, sort of a love it or hate it voice, though. Yeah. I don't think he was ever as polarizing as Geddy Lee, but he's definitely more in the Geddy Lee wheelhouse.
Absolutely.
Than Ozzy. And he doesn't sound like their other real contemporaries, which would be Uriah Heep. They don't sound like Uriah Heep. This is kind of doomy, and there's an interesting aspect to the Budgie record is that something they did for the first 3 or 4 albums, they insert these really fascinating little 1.5 minute folky acoustic numbers. They just sort of dump in the middle of these records, which is kind of, I forget what the one is on this album. I know on the
You
second
and
album
I
it's called Rolling Home Again. I think it's You and I. It's just sort of a fascinating aspect to this. But the centerpiece on this one is a song called Guts, which is a very heavy, it's a rumbler. So, I mean, if you're talking about that wheelhouse that houses Lucifer's Friend, first Black Sabbath album, that's where these guys are coming from.
I think there's a positivity here too that Sabbath lacked in a way. I think there's a little bit of boogie mixed in here, and Burke Shelley's lyrics were hilarious, and the song titles
Rape of the Locks.
Yeah, the song titles too are like Monty Python-esque, kind of bizarre. So there was a sense of fun here as well, right from the beginning. I also want to note that Soundgarden covered Homicidal Suicidal.
True, yeah.
From this album.
That's right, and did a very good job of that. They also covered Into the Void by Sabbath, so they clearly like this kind of stuff.
I didn't like that. They redid the lyrics. I thought that was kind of odd.
Yeah, I don't remember being all that. Yeah, I'm looking at it. I'm looking at the song. But yeah, and the song titles, we have to give a shout out to Nude Disintegrating Parachutist Woman.
Yeah. Great song titles.
Rape of the Locks, which is about a haircut. And, and then the other big monster heavy number on this is Homicidal Suicidal, which closes it out.
Great record. I wish the production did it justice. The material is unique and really strong beyond any genre tag, I believe. And the Budgie were one of the all-time greats. They're kind of like the mascot of all the big guys, and the big guys all stole from them. You can hear not just the covers either, but you can hear a lot of different stuff. If your record collection's big enough, you can hear.
Yeah, a lot of the early Judas Priest, if you listen to the first album or Sad Wings, get a lot from Budgie. And you got to remember, bands like Judas Priest and Thin Lizzy opened up for Budgie back in the early days. People don't realize how big Budgie were in England.
Budgie had one of the longest careers going, and I mean, they never really had a hit album. But I mean, you go through the catalog, you've got the debut, you've got Squawk, Never Turn Your Back on a Friend, which was probably, that might have been their biggest seller, and then In for the Kill. And we should also give a shout out to the original Budgie guitarist, Tony Burge, who was kind of an Iommi type player. He had a really good with riffs. Very heavy player, not a huge soloist guy, but incredibly skilled, and a crucial part of the early Budgie sound. So a lot of that sound is Tony Burge's guitar sound.
And a lot of people compare him, rightfully so, as a cross between Black Sabbath and Rush. They were kind of like doomy meets progressive rock, and I don't know if that was to their disadvantage or not. I think being on MCA Records might have been to their disadvantage, especially here in the States. MCA. They never really did anything.
Musical Cemetery of America.
Exactly. And again, I wasn't as crazy about the debut. I think that was kind of their experimental. They kind of got better and better, and they never quite peaked, as you said. I don't know what the situation. I know in throughout Europe. And like you say, Texas, just like Riot, they were huge because of the one radio station. What was the name? Something Anthony.
Radio station,
in San Antonio, Texas.
Live albums recorded in Texas.
Legs Diamond, Riot, certain bands were Saxon, and Budgie were one of them too. But yeah, interesting enough, they never got the credit here in America. They never had that radio song. I don't think I've ever heard Budgie song.
Never had the radio song, and I think they struggled a lot on U.S. tours. I don't even know if they got proper headlining tours. I think they were like opening for other. I've got a bunch of bootlegs of them playing in St. Louis and things like that. I think in Texas they could probably headline. But this is also a band that's a distinct game of two halves. You have the Tony Burge era, which ends with, I think, Impeccable. And then they were kind of on the decline, and they had a huge comeback. They got another guy on guitar named Big John Thomas. He ended up leading them to become quite popular during the new wave of British heavy metal era. And you would find those Budgie singles from albums like Power Supply, and they were mixed right in with the Riot and the Angel Witch and the Metallica and all that stuff. And they were playing the same festivals. And,
absolutely.
So they had a kind of a resurgence, a second wind to their career. But that was one of the more interesting aspects of the new wave of British heavy metal. It lifted the careers of some old timers Like Nuts is another great example.
Yeah.
They then changed their name to Rage and ended up like having a little bit of a mini run during this thing. Budgie.
Yeah. Quartz is another band that kind of was pre-new wave of British heavy metal. In fact, I think we had them on the...
Quartz goes all the way back to 1977. First album produced by Tony Iommi.
Tony Iommi. Yeah.
They're on our honorable mention list.
One thing I want to mention, though, going back to Riot, the bass player on Narita was Jimmy Iommi. Now, no relation to Tony Iommi, huh? That's kind of an odd last name. You don't see that often, Iommi. Yeah.
No, you don't. And I think nobody's seen him in quite a while. I don't think he's ever... the problem now with Riot is I think there are 4 different versions of Riot running around. There's LA Riot, Riot Z. I can't even keep all these Riots straight. But fair play. Somebody's out there playing the music. That's fine.
I believe Rick Ventura is a part of it, or Kip Lemming.
Rick Ventura was part of the other Riot that had L.A. Kuvaris, who died, so I don't know what they're going to do now. But Riot V is a couple of the guys from the Thundersteel era, which is essentially a totally different band.
Yeah.
Aside from Mark Reel. Anyway, but back to Budgie. This is definitive proto-metal. I like this album a lot, but yes, if we're being honest, you might want to start with Never Turn Your Back on a Friend or In for the Kill if you want the earlier stuff. But this is a very crucial, sort of underappreciated. It's the Budgie album that a lot of people don't talk about. People talk about Squawk more than they talk about the debut.
Right.
Which is the second Budgie album.
Well, should we, before we continue, why don't we do this? Instead of going through honorable mentions, why don't you two kind of recreate the list for 10 definitive ones to talk about for our next episode, and we'll save that for, because I think a lot of these bands are deserving of a full discussion. I would say, if I had to throw out 3, I would say Atomic Rooster's Death Walks Behind You. I think that's one of the great dark rock. It's one of the evilest records ever created, and I think that one definitely deserves talk about. The other one I would have, which didn't make any of our lists, is Buffalo's Volcanic Rock, which I think is the definitive very heavy Australian proto-metal band. And I'm drawing a blank. I'm sure something else will come to me, so I'm going to turn it over to Mayo.
Well, Horace, why don't we bat it around for a couple of days and come up with
let's bat it around for a couple of days and battle out a list. And I have a feeling we will finally give Gamma their due, who are Ronnie's other great band, who never got quite the love that they deserved either. And they just sneak under the wire, because I think that first Gamma album was 1979.
Yep, absolutely. Well, great. Well, once again, fantastic discussion, guys. Always enjoy having you both on as guests, and we will continue with a part 3. We'll try to spread out in a couple months. We'll go for part 3, so you guys can refine the list, and we'll go ahead and do it. Any closing thoughts you guys want, or do you have anything to promote? You want to throw up any websites or anything?
Well, I write for Rock Shop Pop, and we do cover some music stuff over there. So if anybody wants to take a look at it, it's just all one long word, rockshockpop.com, HORACE, Horace Cordier. I'm there. You can find the stuff that I wrote. We cover movies and music. And Mayo has a really good blog that everybody should read. So he should give everybody that information again.
The blog is called Mayo Noise, one word, not mayonnaise, and Mayo Noise. And it's on WordPress, easy to find. Also, the Wargasm reissue series continues. So all of our albums will be re-released on CD. We're already up to the 4th. The 5th is kind of in legal limbo right now, but stay tuned.
You're talking about Suicide Notes? That's the one that's in limbo?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Right.
All right, gentlemen. Well, once again, a pleasure having you guys on, and we will have you back again very soon.
Thanks, Mad Dog.
All right. Thanks, Mad Dog. Thanks, Mayo.
You got it. Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Thank you for listening to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.